we're about 2 weeks out from the election, meaning that in about 2.5 weeks, or however long it takes to count all the votes, we're going to know who's going to be leading the country for the next 4 years. However, regardless of who wins, there is a massive structural problem in America that's colorblind. It's not red, it's not blue, it doesn't really matter who's in office. The design of the system itself will make it such that inflation will reaccelerate. You see, the national debt currently sits at a staggering $35 trillion. Looking at the national debt on a timeline, you can see that the increase over the last 100 years has been incredible, going from about $400 billion in 1923 to $35 trillion today, an increase of about 8,750%. To give you some perspective on that, if the US was to right now completely stop all of its spending, and instead the federal government spent $1 million every single minute to pay off the debt, it would never get paid off. That's because we're currently paying $2 million per minute just to service the interest on that debt. And so today, let's go through the details of the situation as it currently stands and why inflation is basically the only answer to this problem. Again, regardless of who's in office. Let's start at the very beginning. When you look at the federal government's balance sheet, you'll find that the lion's share, the majority of their revenue, comes from personal taxes. The data that you can see up on your screen right now comes directly from the US Treasury, and it shows that in terms of income, the majority of the government's money, it comes from individual income taxes, followed by Social Security and Medicare taxes, and then corporate taxes. Everything else is basically a rounding error in the grand scheme of things. The primary income comes from personal taxes, corporate taxes, and social and Medicare taxes. Now, in the last fiscal year that we have data for, the US federal government took in $4.39 trillion in taxes. And $4.39 trillion is, of course, a lot of money. However, there's an old adage that's attributed to Seneca, which goes like this: "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more that is poor." And indeed, despite the fact that the US has taken in nearly $4.4 trillion of their citizens' hard-earned money, they spent this fiscal year thus far $6.28 trillion, meaning that they are running at a $1.9 trillion deficit, again, so far this year, which is amazing. Only the government could take $4 trillion of money from their citizens and still wind up losing $2 trillion a year. Now, in terms of what this money is spent on, up on your screen is data that, again, comes directly from the US Treasury website. The top expenses for the federal government are as follows. You have Social Security, followed by Medicare. At number 3 is the interest on the debt, followed by healthcare in general, national defense, welfare programs, VA benefits, and so on. And so from that list, there are really 2 important takeaways. The first is that the list is FYTD, meaning that it's fiscal year to date. And so those numbers are still growing because the fiscal year is not yet over. And secondly, you might have noticed that the interest on the debt is now the 3rd largest expense of the entire federal government, more than even the military budget. By the end of this year, we will have spent over $1 trillion on just interest payments alone. If you look at that based on a percentage of yearly spending, interest payments are roughly 20% of all federal spending overall. However, if you look at it based on the amount of actual money taken in by the government, it's roughly a quarter. Out of the $4.4 trillion that's collected in taxes, about a quarter of it goes right back out the door in interest payments. Furthermore, on the Treasury's website, they have a page dedicated to the topic of the national debt with a subsection called Maintaining the National Debt. And here's what that section says, quote, "The national debt has increased every year over the past 10 years. Interest expenses during this period have remained fairly stable due to low interest rates and investors' judgment that the US government has a very low risk of default. However, recent increases in interest rates and inflation are now resulting in an increase in interest expense." And so here is where we get to the crux of the issue. Because for the longest time now, when interest rates were near zero, the problem was manageable. It was never truly sustainable, but it was at the very least in the short term manageable. Up on your screen right now is the interest rate over the last 15 years. And as you can see, starting in the year 2008, when the money printers started going into overdrive, the interest rate was near zero. And so, even though there was more spending, the interest payments did not really increase that much. However, now the interest rate is nearly 5%, which has caused all of the interest and all that debt to skyrocket to where it is now. And so the math here is rather simple. The federal government is currently, right now, paying out a quarter of all the money it collects just to cover the interest on outstanding debt. But at the same time, they are also spending way above their means, and so every single year, they're borrowing an additional $2 trillion and adding to the debt. That additional $2 trillion of debt also has interest attached to it, and so it's a compounding effect in the wrong direction. People say that investing in the stock market can make you rich because of the compound effect. However, the exact opposite is true here. It's essentially a downward spiral, and it has the potential to get a lot worse. This graph right here, which uses data from the Congressional Budget Office, it shows that interest payments could very well double within the next 30 years. And so while right now we have 25% of our tax revenue going to interest, by the year 2050, that number could easily be 50%. And that's probably actually a conservative estimate. And so what's to be done here? One option is for politicians to cut spending. However, good luck with that, because even though all the aid that we send to all these other countries, Ukraine, Israel, Lebanon, Afghanistan for some reason, even though that does make headlines, it's a tiny percentage of the spending. If we cut all that controversial spending, it won't make a dent in this problem. To make a real difference, you have to touch some of the core areas that the US spends on. Here's the chart again. What politician do you know of who is willing to touch any of these items? Social Security, Medicare, healthcare, national defense, veteran benefits. Every one of those line items is politically sacrosanct. And so there is no serious political will in either party to shrink any of those categories. Now, the US government could just print the money to pay off the debt. However, that's exactly the action which will trigger a resurgence in double-digit inflation. If they add trillions of new dollars to the money supply to pay off the existing debt, then sure, technically they would pay off the debt. But then as a consequence, you would have trillions of more dollars in circulation chasing the same amount of goods and services. And the end result will be exactly what happened after COVID. Starting in the year 2020, the money supply was expanded by about $16 trillion. And then subsequently, inflation rose to double digits. The price of eggs, it went from like $4 to $7 or $8. And so you can imagine what'll happen to prices again if you do this again to pay off the debt. And so that's option one. The government could print more money, but that will have the effect of creating more serious inflation. Option two is to downsize the government itself, to basically cut the government spending by cutting federal programs. This option is being pushed forward right now by Elon Musk. About a month ago, you had Donald Trump announce that if he were to be reelected, he would assign Elon Musk to be the head of a government efficiency commission.
I will create a government efficiency commission tasked with conducting a complete financial and performance audit of the entire federal government and making recommendations for drastic reforms. We need to do it. Can't go on the way we are now. And Elon, because he's not very busy, has agreed to head that task force. Be interesting. If he has the time, it'll be a good one to do it, but he's agreed to do it.
And since making that announcement, you've had Elon Musk make several statements of his own saying that he would like to fire about 80% of the government workforce.
Do we really need, whatever it is, 428 federal agencies? I think we should be able to get away with 99 agencies. Like, if there's so many that people have never even heard of, and that have overlapping areas of responsibility.
Now, he probably won't be able to achieve that, but that's the ethos that he's bringing with him to this position, to fire 80% of the workforce. However, let's say he achieves it, and the federal government's workforce is really reduced by 80%. Even if that is a good plan in the long term for increasing personal freedom, rolling back bureaucracy, and potentially eliminating government waste, well, in today's episode, we're talking about inflation. And you might assume that an 80% cut of federal employees will decrease inflation. But actually, the exact opposite might happen. You see, if right now you go over to Google and you search who is the largest employer in the world, you'll find that the US federal government is the largest employer in the whole world, and definitely the largest employer in the US. And so think about it. If you have the largest employer in America suddenly firing 80% of its workforce, what will happen to the government's tax revenue? It will naturally plummet, at least in the short term. Therefore, to fund all the various programs that the government can't cut, they'll have to borrow even more money to pay for it. That will increase the national debt as well as the interest payments on that debt. And so you see, in the short term, there is no escaping this problem. The can has already been kicked so far down the road, that there's really no good options left. Regardless of what the next administration does, whether it's printing more money or downsizing the size of the federal government, it doesn't really matter. Inflation will have to reaccelerate either way because the interest on the debt has to be paid. Now, there is something in passing that I'd like to mention, which is that 208 years ago, you had Thomas Jefferson, who is of course the third president of the US, write this in a letter, quote, "I am not among those who fear the people. They, and not the rich, are our dependents for continued freedom. And to preserve their independence, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt." That was written in 1860. However, 208 years later, the nation now stands at a staggering $35 trillion in debt. If you divide that number by the number of citizens in this country, it means that everyone, every American man, woman, and child owes approximately $100,000. Every baby born in this country is born with a $100,000 albatross tied around their neck. And just as an aside, the way that government debt works is not unlike financial slavery. The government sells a bond, which is just an IOU. It's a promise that if you give me some money today, I'll give you back more money a few years from now. But the government does not have its own money. It's actually your money that they're promising. They are funding their programs by selling your future time and your future effort. And so just as an example, let's say that your income is taxed at 30%. That means in practical terms that from January until April, you essentially work for free. You work for the government. And out of that, a full 1 month of your income is taken just to service the interest payments for whoever happens to own American bonds. For a full month, the fruits of all your work goes to pay China, Japan, Germany, whoever happens to own those bonds. And as the amount of interest increases, the amount of time that you're going to have to spend paying for that debt increases as well. In 30 years from now, your kids, they'll probably be spending 2 months every year paying for this debt. And also, by inflating the money supply, it forces you to pay more for things. And therefore, you have to work more hours to pay for the same goods and services, which essentially steals even more of your time and effort. If you'd like to go deeper into this story, into the story of the Federal Reserve and this staggering situation with the national debt that we find ourselves in, I'll throw the links to several resources down into the description box below, including the link to a phenomenal documentary which shows sort of the inner workings of the Federal Reserve and how the system was set up and how pretty much no matter what anyone does, it's a system that has to create more and more inflation just to sustain itself. It's a great documentary. I'll throw that link down in the description box below if you want to sort of dive deeper into it. And also, with the election coming up very, very soon, I'd like to mention that we here at the Epoch Times put together a phenomenal infographic detailing the positions of the two candidates based on actual facts and policies. It strips away all the hyperbole and all the talking points, and it looks at the actual policies between Harris and Trump. If you want to get access to that infographic, it's a digital infographic. It's awesome. It's about this size. If you look at it on your screen, well, you can get access to it for $1 by subscribing to the Epoch Times. That way, you'll get not only access to everything on the Epoch Times website, but also you'll get access to that infographic. It'll be sent directly to your inbox as soon as you sign up, and you can cancel at any time. It's just sort of an introductory offer to get you through the door so that you'll fall in love with the content and be a subscriber for a long time to come. And so claim your infographic and try the Epoch Times yourself. I'll throw the link to subscribe. It'll be right there at the top of the description box below. Hope you take advantage of that offer. And then until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed. Most importantly, stay free.